You're standing in rural Georgia, staring at pyramids that shouldn't exist. A fiberglass sphinx, painted hieroglyphs. It looks like a movie set left behind after the crew wrapped and vanished. Then the SUVs roll up. FBI agents push past you and into the hollow monuments. They aren't here for artifacts. They're here for a man who told his followers he was Yarnoun, an alien from the planet Rizq. His name is Dwight York. For decades, he turned space mythology and Egyptian mysticism into a working machine. A compound called Tama-Re, dressed like ancient Egypt, but built like a carnival float. Here's the sinister part. The spectacle wasn't the point. It was camouflage. This is the story of Dwight York and the Nuwaubian Nation, and how an invented language, a pyramid, landing pad, and a pay-to-love system led to the largest criminal reckoning this cult would ever face. You want to understand how someone convinces hundreds of people they're from outer space? Start with this. York never stayed the same person long enough for anyone to figure out who he really was. In 1967, he began in Brooklyn as a Sunni Muslim, founding the Ansar Pure Sufi. Nothing too unusual there, just another Islamic group in New York City. But within 2 years, he'd already shapeshifted. The group became the Nuwaubian Islamic Hebrew Mission, mixing Islamic teachings with Hebrew iconography. That should have been the first warning sign. Real religious leaders don't reinvent their core beliefs every few years. By 1973, another transformation. The Ansaru Allah community. Now York was incorporating UFO themes into his cosmology. Islam to Hebrew, mysticism to alien contact, all within 6 years. But here's the sinister part. This wasn't confusion, it was strategy. Think about what that did to his followers. Every time they thought they understood their faith, York changed the rules. Every time they found stability in a doctrine, he introduced new revelations. They couldn't ground their beliefs in any external source, not the Quran, not the Torah, not any established religious text. York became their only constant, their sole interpreter of an ever-shifting truth. The genius was in the chaos itself. While most cults depend on rigid dogma, York used ideological instability as his weapon of choice. His followers were perpetually off balance, desperately trying to keep up with the latest version of reality. And the only person who could guide them through that maze? York himself. But the real control came through language. During the Brooklyn years, York invented something called Nubic, supposedly a mixture of Sudanese, Arabic, and Ebonics. Children in the community were separated from their parents and raised communally, forbidden to speak English. A 1986 school board inspection found that some Ansar children did not speak a word of English. Think about that level of isolation. These kids couldn't communicate with the outside world, even if they wanted to. They were trapped in York's linguistic prison, cut off from any reality that didn't flow through him. When you control someone's language, you control their thoughts. When you control their thoughts, you control their world. The doctrinal shifts kept accelerating. In the late 1980s and early 90s, York began claiming he was an extraterrestrial named Yarnoun from the planet Rizq. The group's beliefs became a bizarre fusion of black nationalism, UFO mythology, and Egyptian iconography. White people were Palaman, cursed with leprosy. The righteous 144,000 would be saved during an apocalypse in the 2000s. Ancient aliens called the Anunnaki had created black people as their descendants. None of it made sense. But that was the point. York understood something most people miss about belief. Consistency isn't what keeps followers loyal, dependency is. Every time he changed the doctrine, his followers had to choose. Abandon everything they'd invested in this community, or trust that their leader knew something they didn't. Most chose trust, and York made sure they had nowhere else to go. He taught that the outside world was doomed, controlled by evil forces. Only he possessed the right knowledge to navigate the coming apocalypse. Only he could interpret the constantly evolving truth. Only he could save them. By 1992, the group had transformed again, now calling itself the Holy Tabernacle Ministries, emphasizing Jewish themes while maintaining its black nationalist worldview. But York wasn't done shape-shifting. The most audacious transformation was still coming. The man who'd started as a Brooklyn Muslim was about to become an Egyptian god in rural Georgia. And that's where the real horror would unfold, hidden behind pyramids that were never meant to last, in a compound designed not for worship, but for predation. In 1993, York made his boldest move yet. He abandoned the urban sprawl of Brooklyn for 476 acres of rural Georgia farmland, paying nearly $1 million for property in Putnam County. But this wasn't just a relocation, it was the construction of a physical manifestation of his delusions. York renamed his followers the United Nuwaubian Nation of Moors and began building what he called Tama-Re. From a distance, it looked impressive. Egyptian-style pyramids rising from Georgia farmland, a sphinx replica guarding the entrance, hieroglyphics covering every surface. Tour buses started arriving. Local newspapers called it a tourist attraction. But look closer at the construction photos, and you'll see the truth. These weren't ancient monuments. They were built with the color scheme and structural integrity of a carnival ride. The pyramids were hollow shells. The Sphinx was fiberglass and paint. The entire compound had the permanence of a movie set, because that's essentially what it was, an elaborate stage for York's performance as a divine being. The centerpiece was a large pyramid that York claimed would serve as a landing pad for the mothership, also called the Mother Plane, Nibiru, or the Crystal City. This celestial vessel would arrive during the apocalypse to rescue the righteous 144,000. The pyramid wasn't just decoration. It was supposedly functional, alien technology, a beacon to guide extraterrestrial saviors to rural Georgia. Think about the psychology behind this spectacle. York's followers had invested everything, their money, their identities, their children's futures, in following this man. Now they could point to something tangible, something that proved their leader was special. Here was physical evidence of their beliefs. Pyramids in Georgia, just like York had promised. The visual propaganda was overwhelming, but while tourists saw an eccentric religious theme park, something far darker was happening inside those fake monuments. The elaborate Egyptian facade wasn't built to honor ancient gods. It was constructed to hide systematic criminal activity. The spectacle was the perfect cover for the real business York was conducting: the sexual abuse of children and the financial exploitation of his followers. By 1998, over 200 Nuwaubians lived at Tama-Re. They'd created their own isolated world, complete with its own rules, its own language, its own version of reality. And at the center of it all was York, now calling himself Dr. Malachi Z. York, claiming to be both an Egyptian pharaoh and an extraterrestrial deity. The local sheriff, Howard Sills, found himself in an impossible position. He'd done his homework on York, gathering intelligence from the FBI about the leader's history in New York, suspected connections to organized bank robberies, possible involvement in murder, decades of criminal activity disguised as religious leadership. Sills knew this wasn't just an unconventional religious group. But how do you investigate someone who claims religious freedom and racial persecution? How do you scrutinize a black nationalist group without being accused of discrimination? York had chosen his location strategically: rural Georgia, where law enforcement would be hesitant to appear heavy-handed with a minority religious community. Sills instructed his deputies to take a careful approach. Ignore minor infractions. Avoid confrontation. Don't give York any excuse to claim persecution. The sheriff understood he was dealing with people who genuinely believed York was a deity, who saw Tama-Re as a sovereign nation. One wrong move could trigger a violent confrontation. Meanwhile, York was perfecting his greatest deception. He'd convinced his followers that the outside world was evil, that only he possessed the knowledge to navigate the coming apocalypse. The compound's isolation reinforced this message. Inside Tama-Re, York's word was law. Outside was danger, corruption, spiritual death. The fake pyramids served their purpose perfectly. They attracted attention, generated revenue through tourism, and provided a visual anchor for York's mythology. But most importantly, they created a physical barrier between his followers and reality. Inside those hollow monuments, York was building something far more sinister than a tourist attraction. He was constructing a machine designed for exploitation, and the real horror was just beginning. The green room system was York's most insidious invention, a mechanism that turned fundraising into sexual coercion and reduced human relationships to transactions. Here's how it worked. Male followers, called propagators, were given strict monthly fundraising quotas. These men had to hit the streets of Atlanta, selling York's books and pamphlets, recruiting new members, collecting donations. The quotas weren't suggestions, they were survival requirements. Miss your quota, and you faced immediate, brutal consequences. Propagators were beaten for falling short of their financial targets. But meet your numbers? You earned access to the green room, where you could spend time with your female mate. York had literally monetized intimacy, turning love into a reward system controlled entirely by his whims. Think about what this did to relationships within the community. Husbands couldn't see their wives unless they generated enough cash for York. Fathers were separated from their children based on their fundraising performance. Every human connection became conditional on financial compliance. York had weaponized the most basic human need, the need for companionship, and turned it into a tool of control. But the propagators were just one layer of York's exploitation machine. The real horror was what was happening to the children. Kids at Tama-Re were systematically separated from their parents and raised communally. They were forbidden to speak English, forced to learn only York's invented Nubic language and Arabic. This wasn't cultural education, it was cognitive imprisonment. These children couldn't communicate with the outside world, couldn't call for help, couldn't even articulate what was happening to them in a language that outsiders would understand. The educational isolation went deeper. Children were taught that the outside world was evil, that white people were cursed, palamen, that only York possessed the knowledge necessary for salvation. They were raised to see him not as a man, but as a divine being whose commands were absolute and unquestionable. And York used that manufactured reverence to commit unspeakable crimes. Federal prosecutors would later describe York as having devolved into a sexual predator of unprecedented proportions. He systematically molested and sexually abused countless children within his organization. The scale was so vast that prosecutors deliberately reduced the charges from over 1,000 counts to just over 200. Not because of lack of evidence, but because they feared a jury simply wouldn't believe the true magnitude of the abuse. York had created the perfect predatory environment. Children who couldn't speak English couldn't report abuse to authorities. Parents who were financially dependent on the organization couldn't risk challenging their leader. Followers who believed York was literally divine couldn't conceive that their god might be a criminal. The coercive control framework was complete and self-reinforcing. York controlled the money through the quota system. He controlled relationships through the green room. He controlled information through the invented language and isolated education. He controlled spirituality through his constantly shifting doctrines, and he controlled bodies through systematic abuse disguised as religious practice. But there was another layer to his control: the constant threat of expulsion. York taught that leaving the community meant spiritual death, that the outside world would destroy anyone who abandoned the right knowledge. Followers who questioned his authority weren't just risking their place in the group, they were risking their eternal souls, children's futures. This is how coercive control works in practice. It's not just about believing strange doctrines or following an unusual leader. It's about creating a closed system where every aspect of human existence, financial, sexual, emotional, spiritual, linguistic, flows through one person. York didn't just want his followers' money or their bodies. He wanted their minds, their identities, their capacity for independent thought. The fake pyramids and alien mythology were just the packaging. The real product was total human submission. And for over 30 years, the machine ran smoothly. Children grew up knowing no other reality. Adults became financially dependent on the system. Families were restructured around York's desires. The outside world remained unaware of what was happening behind the Egyptian facade. But machines break down, and York's carefully constructed system of exploitation was about to face its greatest test: the scrutiny of federal law enforcement and the courage of survivors willing to break their silence. The reckoning was coming. For decades, one factor protected York more than his fake pyramids or alien mythology: the fear of appearing discriminatory. Journalist Bill Osinski documented how investigations were repeatedly paralyzed by concerns about targeting a black religious leader. Law enforcement agencies worried about accusations of racial persecution. Social services hesitated to intervene in what appeared to be an unconventional but protected religious community. This paralysis wasn't accidental. York had weaponized identity politics as his shield. Every time authorities showed interest in Tama-Re, York's followers cried religious persecution and racial discrimination. The optics were terrible. White law enforcement targeting a black nationalist group practicing their faith on private property. For over 30 years, this dynamic allowed the abuse to continue unchallenged. But Sheriff Howard Sills wasn't paralyzed by political correctness. He'd been building a case methodically, working with federal investigators who understood that this wasn't about religion, it was about organized crime. The breakthrough came when federal prosecutors decided to pursue the case under RICO statutes. The Racketeer, Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act wasn't designed for religious groups. It was created to dismantle criminal enterprises. By framing York's organization as a racketeering operation rather than a religious movement, prosecutors shifted the entire legal framework. The RICO approach was brilliant because it focused on patterns of criminal behavior rather than religious beliefs. Prosecutors didn't need to prove that York's alien claims were false. They needed to prove that he'd used his organization to commit systematic crimes, moving children across state lines for sexual abuse, structuring financial transactions to avoid reporting requirements, operating a criminal enterprise disguised as a religious organization. York was arrested in May 2002, and the evidence was overwhelming. 14 victims testified during the federal trial, describing years of systematic sexual abuse. Financial records revealed the sophisticated money laundering operation hidden beneath the religious facade. The pattern of racketeering was undeniable. On January 23, 2004, a federal jury convicted York on 10 counts, including RICO violations, transporting minors for criminal sexual activity, and financial crimes. The conviction was legally significant because it officially classified the Nuwaubian Nation not as a religious group, but as a criminal enterprise. York was sentenced to 135 years in federal prison, effectively a life sentence. He's currently housed at ADX Florence in Colorado, the Supermax facility reserved for the most dangerous criminals in America. The man who claimed to be an extraterrestrial deity now spends his days in a concrete cell, his alien powers apparently insufficient to secure his freedom. Following the conviction, federal authorities seized Tama-Re under asset forfeiture laws. The fake pyramids were demolished. The Sphinx was destroyed. The land was sold, with proceeds distributed to law enforcement agencies. The physical manifestation of York's delusions was erased from the Georgia landscape as if it had never existed, but some followers still believe. Even today, a small group maintains that York was a political prisoner, targeted by a racist justice system for his revolutionary teachings. They point to the demolished compound as evidence of government persecution, unable to accept that their divine leader was actually a predator who used their faith to facilitate decades of abuse. York's true identity was never alien. He was something far more terrifying and familiar, a predator who understood how to weaponize human belonging. He knew that people desperate for identity and purpose would follow anyone who promised them significance, even if that person claimed to be from outer space. Subscribe for more stories about how ordinary people fall for extraordinary lies.